Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. So, I got a story for you. Trust me, you'll want to buckle up for this one. It's about my first, and spoiler alert, last Tinder date. Now I heard enough weird Tinder stories to write a book, but none could prepare me for what I experienced. I just graduated college and moved to Asheville, a beautiful city nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. As you'd expect, I was pretty lonely, and after my friends enthusiastically endorsed the idea, I joined the magical world of Tinder. It didn't take me long to match with Mike. He was an attractive guy. He came across as charming, confident, and had a bio that screamed adventurous spirit. Mike suggested we go for a late-night hike for our first date. I was initially hesitant. A night hike with a guy I'd met online. It screamed horror movie scenario, but his assurance and my friend's pep talks about being spontaneous and embracing the adventure nudged me to agree. On the day of the date, I drove to the remote trailhead where Mike had asked me to meet him. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows that caused a quiver to run down my body. As I waited for Mike, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a mistake. When Mike arrived, he was everything his profile had suggested: enthusiastic, confident, and ruggedly handsome. We started our hike, the trail illuminated by our flashlights and the scant light from the crescent moon. He led the way, pointing out various landmarks and interesting flora. I noticed he was dodging certain topics about his past, skirting around them like a politician. My worry started to grow, but I dismissed it as first date nerves. As we ventured further, I started noticing strange symbols etched onto the tree trunks. There were discarded, torn pieces of clothing strewn around. An old, tattered shoe, a faded, ripped shirt, each more unsettling than the last. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I realized this wasn't ordinary hiking territory. Mike then started narrating local legends about the woods we were hiking in. Stories about people who'd mysteriously disappeared, ghost sightings, and tales of the supernatural. Each tale was more bone-chilling than the previous. The air felt denser, the night darker, the path longer. And then Mike excused himself to answer nature's call. I waited, my nerves dancing a jittery jig. Minutes turned into half an hour, and he still hadn't returned. Now I was truly scared. Was this part of the story? Was I part of the story? Feeling panicky, I decided to call the police, but of course, my phone had zero signal. I found myself accidentally opening Mike's Tinder profile in my frantic attempts to get a signal. And there they were, reviews from his previous dates, all hinting at their terrifying experiences. My heart sank. I was just another girl in his catalog of horror pranks. I was alone in an unfamiliar, creepy forest. The only sound was my heart pounding in my ears and an occasional hoot from a distant owl. Then came the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible, but there. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I could see shadowy figures darting between the trees out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned around, there was nothing. At that point, it was all about survival. A primal part of me took over. I had to get out of those woods. I focused on retracing our path, every echo of my racing footfalls sounding like a predator's chase. Time blurred, and I don't know how long I ran or how many times I fell, but I finally saw the lights of the parking lot. The relief was overwhelming. But as I reached the trailhead, I saw Mike. He was there talking to a couple of guys, laughing. My fear turned into fury. He confessed that it was all a prank, a plot to make the date memorable. Well, it was memorable, all right. You can bet I reported him on Tinder. I even took it to the local women's group, warning them about this reckless idiot who thought terrifying pranks were a good idea for a first date. And as for me, let's just say that I'm sticking to meeting people the old-fashioned way. My terrifying Tinder experience, the night of my horrifying hike, remains a story that I recount to every new friend I make. But hey, if there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that I'm stronger than I think. I made it out of those woods on my own, and if I can do that, I can do anything. So there you have it, my unforgettable, truly unique, worst ever Tinder date. Be careful out there, folks. Life can get weird, especially if you're swiping right. There's a certain thrill to online dating. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to dive into the unknown, not sure whether you'll be met with cool, refreshing water or jagged rocks. The day I swiped right on Amani, I was submerged in the waves of that excitement, sitting on a leather couch in my small apartment, aimlessly scrolling through profile after profile. Amani's profile stood out, a breath of fresh air among a sea of self-proclaimed travel junkies and foodies. She had a sparkling smile that exuded warmth, and her bio, a witty, quirky mixture of her love for vintage vinyl records, 60s French cinema, and strawberry milkshakes, was compelling. My thumb instinctively moved right, and to my delight, it was a match. Our text exchanges were light and fun, full of music recommendations and playful banter. There was a natural flow to our conversation that made me eager to meet her in person. We agreed to meet at Café Noir, a quaint coffee shop tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, known for its French pastries and strong brew. As I walked towards Café Noir, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. I felt a peculiar mix of excitement and apprehension in the pit of my stomach, a pre-date cocktail of emotions I had come to recognize. Entering the coffee shop, I spotted Amani at a table by the window. I was instantly drawn to her radiant smile and expressive eyes, her auburn hair catching the sunlight filtering through the glass. We began with pleasantries, delving into each other's work, hobbies, and the books we'd recently read. She spoke with an animated enthusiasm that was infectious, her eyes lighting up as she discussed the latest dystopian novel she had devoured. Her passion was magnetic, and I found myself getting lost in her stories and her gestures, her fingers tracing patterns on her coffee cup as she spoke. As the minutes turned into hours, however, I noticed a shift in her demeanor. Her effervescence began to dim, replaced by a restlessness that was unsettling. She seemed to grow increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting around the room, her fingers tapping rhythmically against her coffee cup. Her speech became disjointed, her previously eloquent sentences reduced to a torrent of disconnected thoughts and ideas. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but her behavior became more erratic. Her bright energy had morphed into a relentless intensity. One moment she was rambling about an obscure indie band, the next she was vehemently dissecting a political issue. Her thoughts flitted between topics like a hummingbird unable to decide on flower. The more erratic her behavior became, the more I felt an uncomfortable realization settle within me. This was no longer just about quirky interests or her passionate nature. This was an unnerving manifestation of an underlying issue that was far beyond the normal jittery nerves of a first date. As our date continued, her behavior began to change in ways that were subtle at first, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying close attention. Initially, she had a vivacious energy that I found irresistible, like a whirlwind of warmth and exuberance that drew me in. But as the minutes ticked by, her energy began to escalate into a frantic restlessness that was hard to ignore. Her hands fidgeted constantly, as if in sync with the rapid rhythm of her thoughts, and her legs shook incessantly under the table. Her eyes, previously alight with interest, now darted about the room as if she was expecting someone or something to appear. It was almost like she was physically unable to keep her gaze on me or anything for long. I noticed her pupils dilating and contracting intermittently, the bright brown of her irises giving way to the ominous black at erratic intervals. Her speech patterns also became increasingly disjointed. She jumped from one topic to another with no apparent connection, as if her mind was a jukebox shuffling through random songs at double speed. She would start a sentence about her favorite music, then abruptly pivot to talking about an obscure mathematical theorem or a childhood memory, leaving her sentences half-finished as her thoughts started in a new direction. There were moments when she would suddenly laugh, a loud, unsettling sound that seemed entirely out of place in our conversation. It was as if she was responding to some unseen joke, a private conversation unfolding in her mind. It was both intriguing and alarming to witness this. I found myself trying to keep up, straining to understand her perspective, but her mental pace was dizzying. Her mood also fluctuated dramatically. One moment she was passionately excited, her words spilling out of her in a torrent of enthusiasm, her eyes bright and intense. But in the next, her face would fall into a severe frown, her words growing cold and her energy dropping precipitously. It was like watching the weather shift unpredictably, from sunshine to storm and back again in the span of a few heartbeats. Anxiety gnawed at me, making my chest feel tight. The bustling cafe seemed to shrink around us, the clattering dishes and murmuring patrons fading into a distant echo. The afternoon sunlight, once warm and welcoming, cast long, chilling shadows that mirrored my inner turmoil. Despite the unease, I could not ignore the pang of empathy I felt for her. As a person who has dealt with mental health issues within my family, I could recognize the telltale signs. The erratic speech, the wild energy, the disjointed thought patterns. They were familiar demons. I found myself torn between my desire to comfort her and my instinct to protect myself from a situation that was spiraling out of control. With every passing second, her behavior became more unpredictable, her speech more rapid and incoherent. Despite the alarm bells ringing in my head, I felt a deep sorrow for Amani and the internal battle she was clearly fighting. I left Cafe Nora that day with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions. Dating, I realize, is more than just shared interests and physical attraction. It's a glimpse into the other person's world, sometimes illuminating corners that are dark and complex. As I walked away, the bitter aftertaste of coffee on my tongue, I made a silent promise to be more understanding, more aware of the battles we are all fighting, often invisible to the naked eye. That day I swiped right at a girl named Amani, drawn in by her quirky interests and beautiful smile. What I experienced, though, was a first date that was an unpredictable roller coaster, a heart-wrenching insight into the complexity of human minds, and a stark reminder that everyone we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about. When I was fresh out of college, a hopeful soul full of ambition, I decided to dip my toes into the chaotic waters of online dating. I joined Tinder, and after a few days of swiping left and right, I matched with Adam. His profile was a tad cryptic but intriguing, a self-proclaimed music junkie, weekend chef, and a digital nomad. A myriad of travel pictures with captivating captions kept me interested, and I felt a twinge of excitement as we began to chat. The first few conversations were just like any other. Icebreakers, shared interests, the usual getting to know you chatter. Adam was an eloquent writer. His words flowed like a smooth melody, never missing a beat. He had a knack for asking questions that made me reveal more about myself than I initially intended. He was interested in everything: my favorite color, the type of music I listened to, my friends, my family, my favorite haunts around the city. Every nook and cranny of my life. It felt like we had an authentic connection. Adam suggested we meet after about a week of continuous texting. He proposed we go to my favorite coffee shop, an obscure little place tucked away in a side alley that even some of my close friends didn't know about. I was taken aback by his suggestion, but rationalized it as an odd coincidence. We decided to meet on a chilly Saturday afternoon. I spent hours picking an outfit, not too casual, but not overly formal, perfectly teetering between a well-planned look. And then I just threw this on vibe. Nervous but excited, I made my way to the coffee shop, clutching my phone with the last few encouraging texts from my friends. As I entered the cafe, I was hit with a familiar scent of freshly ground coffee, a comfort that calmed my nerves. I spotted Adam, already seated, poring over what looked like a music magazine, a tiny detail he remembered from our conversations. The date started off just fine, like any other, yet, as time passed, Adam began making uncannily specific comments about a concert I attended last year, a holiday I took to Greece with my friends, even mentioning the names of my 2 dogs, which I had never brought up. He spoke about a book I'd recently finished, and he knew my sister's nickname, which even some of her friends didn't know. It was subtle, no overtly creepy statements, but a prickle of uneasiness began to take root, a cold sensation that turned my stomach. I rationalized it in my head. Maybe I'd mentioned these things in passing, but deep down I knew I hadn't. Each new revelation was like a tiny pebble in my shoe, minor on its own, but together causing a discomfort I couldn't shake off. His knowledge wasn't limited to my past. He casually mentioned an art exhibit that was happening the following week, the one I had marked on my calendar but told no one about. My heavy heart pounded aggressively in my chest. How did he know? As I looked into his calm and collected eyes, it dawned on me. He knew too much. Too much about my life, my routines, my preferences. Information I had never shared with him. The realization crashed me like a frigid wave. I had a stalker. My mind was in overdrive. Thoughts, fears, and confusion spiraled in a vortex of panic. The comfortable familiarity of the coffee shop became a terrifying stage. The soft chatter and clinking mugs a distant echo as my heart pounded in my ears. Trying to maintain a calm facade, I found myself hyper-aware of my actions. Every nod, every smile was a calculated move to avoid raising suspicion. I felt like an actor in a twisted play, forced to improvise the script as I went along. Despite the internal chaos, I was mindful not to let any sign of my fear show. I bit my lip to keep it from trembling and held onto my cold coffee cup a little tighter to steady my shaking hands. I matched his calm demeanor with forced smiles and careful responses, all the while plotting my escape. When I finally managed to excuse myself from the date, the relief was mixed with a deep sense of dread. I felt as though I had escaped a predator's den, but the fear of being hunted still lingered. I walked home with brisk steps, glancing over my shoulder every now and then, my senses on high alert. I bolted out of the cafe, the chilling wind hitting my face, but it did nothing to dissipate the terror boiling inside me. All the pieces clicked into place. The intrusive questions, the seemingly innocuous suggestions, the shared interest that felt too perfectly matched, it was all calculated. After reaching the safety of my home, the gravity of the situation finally hit me, and I broke down. Every nerve, every cell in my body was on edge, the adrenaline leaving me exhausted yet far too terrified to rest. I felt violated, my private life intruded by a man who had been nothing more than a stranger. The reality was chilling, and it shook me to my core. With shaking hands, I deleted Tinder, blocked Adam on all possible social platforms, and informed my friends and family about the unnerving encounter. They rallied around me, assuring me that they would look out for me. In the following weeks, I lived in constant anxiety, always checking behind my shoulder, doubting every shadow, every unknown face. I'm older now, more cautious. The gullibility that allowed me to ignore those red flags has been replaced by a guarded vigilance. I still don't know who Adam truly was or why he chose to invade my life in such a terrifying way. I may never know. But that one terrifying Tinder date taught me a valuable lesson. Never share too much because you never know who is watching. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.